On the morning of September 8th, 1900, the children of St. Mary's Orphanage went to the beach. There were 93 of them, ranging from infants to teenagers, and the 10 Sisters of Charity who ran the orphanage had decided that a Saturday at the shore was exactly what the children needed. The Gulf of Mexico was rough that morning, rougher than usual, with swells rolling in from the south that made the water brown and churned up the sand. Some of the older boys waded in anyway. The sisters watched from the beach. It was warm, the way early September in Texas is always warm, and the sky was the kind of overcast that can mean nothing or can mean everything. By that evening, all 93 children and all 10 sisters would be dead. Their bodies, tied together with rope, the sisters had bound the children to themselves so none would be lost in the dark, were found days later, tangled in the wreckage of what had been their home. The rope had held. It just hadn't helped. Galveston in 1900 was the most prosperous city in Texas and one of the wealthiest in the American South. It sat on a barrier island 30 miles long and 2 miles wide, separated from the mainland by a shallow bay. The Gulf of Mexico on one side, Galveston Bay on the other. The highest point on the island was 8.5 feet above sea level. Most of it was considerably lower. The city's 38,000 residents had been told, repeatedly, and by people who knew better, that this was not a problem. The island's gentle slope would dissipate any wave. The Gulf had never produced a storm large enough to threaten Galveston. The city was safe. They had been told this so many times by such confident voices that most of them believed it. Some didn't. The ones who didn't left before nightfall on September 8th. The ones who did stayed home, or went to friends' houses to watch the interesting weather, or stood on the beach that morning and watched the brown swells roll in, not understanding yet what those swells were carrying behind them. 4 days before the storm hit Galveston, meteorologists in Cuba had been tracking a tropical cyclone moving through the Caribbean. The Cuban Weather Service, run by a Jesuit priest named Benito Viñas, who had spent decades studying Caribbean hurricanes, had developed some of the most accurate forecasting methods in the world at that time. Their prediction was specific. The storm would move northwest, strike the Gulf Coast somewhere between Texas and Louisiana, and would be severe. They telegraphed their warning to Washington. The United States Weather Bureau ignored it. The relationship between the American meteorological establishment and the Cuban service was not collegial. American forecasters considered themselves more rigorous, more scientific, more reliable than their Cuban counterparts, and they were not inclined to defer to a Catholic priest with a barometer. The official American forecast for September 8th predicted the storm would curve northeast and make landfall on the Florida coast. It would miss Texas entirely. Isaac Cline was the chief meteorologist for the U.S. Weather Bureau in Galveston. He was 36 years old, confident, and in 1891 had published an article arguing that a hurricane striking Galveston with catastrophic force was essentially impossible. The shape of the Gulf floor, he wrote, the gradual slope of the island, these factors would prevent any dangerous storm surge from reaching the city. He had staked his professional reputation on this assessment. On the morning of September 8th, as the barometric pressure dropped and the swells increased, Cline drove his buggy along the beach and told people the weather was unusual, but not dangerous. "Go home if you're worried," he said. But there's no real cause for alarm. By early afternoon, he had changed his mind. He sent a telegram to Washington, warning that the storm was far more severe than predicted, and that Galveston was in serious danger. Then he drove back along the beach, warning people to move to higher ground. The problem was that there was no higher ground. The highest point on the island was 8.5 feet. The storm surge that was coming was going to be 15. Around noon on September 8th, the Gulf of Mexico began moving across Galveston Island. Not in waves, the water simply rose, the way water rises in a bathtub, steadily and from everywhere at once. The streets filled from below, water pushing up through the drainage grates, bubbling up through the sand in the lower-lying parts of town. Within 2 hours, the streets had a foot of water in them. Within 4 hours, 3 feet. The wind by mid-afternoon was measuring over 70 miles per hour and rising. The storm had not yet reached its peak. That would come after dark, but it was already strong enough to tear roofing material off buildings, send slate tiles through the air like projectiles, snap telephone poles. The sky had turned a particular shade of yellow-green that people who lived through the storm described for the rest of their lives. Not the gray of an ordinary storm. Yellow-green, the color the sky turns when something is wrong with the atmosphere itself. People who had been watching the rising water from their porches now found water at their front doors, then in their hallways. Some moved to upper floors. Some tried to reach neighbors with more solid houses. A few attempted to cross town, wading through water that was waist-deep and moving fast, pushing against a current now running from the Gulf across the island and into Galveston Bay on the other side. The island wasn't being hit by the sea. The island was going under. The families who lived closest to the beach had no time at all. The storm surge hit the southern shore like a moving wall. Not a wave exactly, but a sudden massive elevation of the entire water surface, driven by pressure and wind, rising faster than any normal tide. Houses on the beach side were simply gone. Not damaged, gone. The lumber, the furniture, the contents of lives, all of it picked up and pushed inland at speed. That lumber is what killed most of the people who died in Galveston on September 8, 1900. Not the water alone, what the water carried. As the storm surge pushed across the island from south to north, it picked up everything in its path. Houses torn apart by wind or lifted by water became raw material. Timber and roofing iron, fencing and furniture, vehicles and telegraph poles. All of it was pushed together by the force of the moving water into a mass that grew as it traveled, absorbing more debris as it destroyed more buildings. By the time this mass reached the center of the island, it was a moving wall of wreckage, 15 feet high and 2 miles wide, rolling across Galveston at several miles per hour. This debris wall was the specific mechanism that made Galveston 1900 unlike any other American storm disaster. A hurricane's wind is dangerous. A storm surge is deadly. But a moving wall of shattered buildings, with everything inside them, nails and glass and iron and timber, advancing through a city at walking speed in the dark and the rain, that is something different. People on the second floor of solid buildings, who had every reason to believe they were safe above the water, were killed when the debris wall reached them. Tons of moving wreckage collapsed their walls from the outside. Survivors described hearing the wall before they saw it, a grinding, roaring sound unlike anything they'd heard before, the sound of a city being compressed into itself. Those in its direct path had seconds to react. Some managed to climb higher. Some grabbed onto floating debris and were carried with it rather than crushed by it. Many were simply in the wrong place at the wrong moment. John Blagden was a young man who spent that night clinging to a piece of roofing iron on top of floating wreckage, carried back and forth across Galveston Bay as the storm pushed water in and then drew it out. He described watching buildings collapse around him in the dark, hearing them go, mostly, because there was almost no light, and the sound of people calling out and then going silent. He survived. He later said that survival that night had almost nothing to do with decisions or preparation. It had to do with where you were standing at 10 o'clock in the evening. The people who tried to save themselves by tying ropes to fixed objects, telegraph poles, large trees, the steel frames of substantial buildings, mostly died. The fixed objects they tied themselves to didn't stay fixed. Poles snapped, trees were uprooted, buildings collapsed. The rope that was meant to hold them to safety held them instead to things that were being destroyed. The Sisters of Charity of the Incarnate Word had run St. Mary's Orphanage on the western end of Galveston Island since 1867. The orphanage consisted of 2 wooden buildings, a boys' dormitory and a girls' dormitory, set close to the beach. The sisters had been watching the storm develop through the day and made the decision that the children were safer staying together in the orphanage than attempting to move them across the flooding island. The buildings were substantial for their time. The sisters were experienced. They had weathered storms before. When the water began rising rapidly in the late afternoon, the sisters gathered all 93 children in the girls' dormitory, which was slightly larger and slightly more solid. They began singing hymns to keep the younger children calm. As the water rose and the building began to shake, the sisters made a decision that made absolute sense in the moment and ended in tragedy. They tied the children to themselves with lengths of clothesline. If the building gave way in the dark, none of the children would be swept off alone. The girls' dormitory collapsed sometime after 8 o'clock in the evening. The debris wall had reached the western end of the island. The building came apart, and the 93 children and 10 sisters went into the water together, bound to each other by the rope that was supposed to save them. 3 of the older boys, teenagers, survived. They managed to free themselves from the rope in the water and were carried to a piece of floating debris that held them until morning. When they were found the next day, they described what they had experienced in the water in language that the people who recorded their accounts found difficult to transcribe. One of them was 15 years old. In the days after the storm, as workers clearing wreckage moved through the western end of the island, they found the bodies of the sisters and children still bound together by the clothesline. The identification was made partly by the rope and partly by the religious medals several of the sisters wore. The bodies were taken to the beach and burned there with the others. By 8 o'clock in the evening, the storm was at its peak. The wind speed was estimated at over 140 miles per hour. The instruments measuring it at the Weather Bureau office were destroyed at around that speed, so the actual peak is unknown. The water across the island stood at 15 feet above normal sea level in many places. In the lower parts of town, the second floor of a typical house was at or below the water line. The darkness was total. The electrical system had failed hours before. There was no moon. The rain came horizontally, mixed with sand and debris, cutting exposed skin. The noise was a continuous roar that made it impossible to hear anything at close range. Voices, cries, the sound of structures failing. People who survived the night in the upper floors of solid buildings described lying in the dark, listening to the house move around them, not knowing if the next movement would be the last one. Several described singing, hymns, popular songs, anything to focus on other than the sound of the storm. The storm began to weaken after midnight. The wind dropped gradually through the early morning hours. The water, which had been held up by the storm's pressure, began to drain. By dawn on September 9th, the wind was strong but manageable. The water was receding. the rain had stopped. The people who had survived the night began to emerge from wherever they had spent it. The first light of September 9th revealed a city that had been partially erased. The southern and western parts of Galveston, the areas closest to the beach, the areas that had caught the full force of the debris wall, were gone. Not damaged, the land was clear. Where there had been residential streets with houses on both sides, there was now open ground covered in wreckage and mud, with isolated structures standing at random intervals, their survival apparently arbitrary. The death toll would eventually be counted, imprecisely because many of the dead were never found, at somewhere between 8,000 and 12,000 people. Out of a city of 38,000, that was between a fifth and a third of the entire population. In absolute numbers, it remains the deadliest natural disaster in American history. The 1906 San Francisco earthquake killed around 3,000 people. Hurricane Katrina killed 1,800. Galveston, 1,900, killed more than both combined in a single night. The immediate problem facing the survivors was the bodies. There were thousands of them across the entire island, in conditions that September heat in Texas made increasingly urgent. The initial decision was to load them onto barges and bury them at sea. The barges went out. The bodies were weighted and dropped into the Gulf. Within days, the Gulf had returned most of them to the beach. The sea wouldn't take them. The decision was made to burn them where they were found. For weeks after the storm, funeral pyres burned across Galveston, on the beach, in the cleared lots where houses had stood, at the edges of the debris field. The smoke was visible from the mainland. Survivors who had left the island before the storm and were trying to return were stopped at the causeway. Nobody was being allowed in without a work permit. The city needed labor to clear the dead, not more people to feed. A man named Richard Lord had sent his wife and children to the mainland the day before the storm because something about the weather made him uneasy. He spent 3 days trying to get back. When he finally got through, his house was standing, one of the ones that had made it. His neighbors on one side were dead. His neighbors on the other side were alive. The lot between them, where another house had stood, was empty. The decision made by the survivors of Galveston 1900 was not to abandon the island. It was to raise it. In one of the most extraordinary engineering projects in American history, Galveston spent the years following the disaster doing something that had never been done at that scale. They lifted the entire city. First, they built a seawall, 17 feet high, 16 feet thick at the base, running along the beach for 10 miles. Then, behind the seawall, they pumped sand dredged from the Gulf floor underneath every building in the city, raising the grade of the island by as much as 17 feet in some areas. Buildings were jacked up on screws and held in place while the sand was pumped beneath them. 500 city blocks were raised. The process took 7 years. It worked. When the next major hurricane hit Galveston in 1915, the seawall held. The raised grade kept the flooding manageable, and the death toll was 8 people. 8 compared to 8,000. The same city, the same Gulf, a completely different outcome because the ground was higher and the wall was there. But Galveston never recovered what it lost in 1900. Before the storm, it was the largest city in Texas, the busiest port in the Gulf, one of the most economically significant cities in the American South. Houston, 30 miles inland, had been a smaller and less important city. After the storm, the railroad companies and the shipping lines began moving their operations to Houston, which had no seawall problem and no memory of watching a third of its population die in one night. By 1910, Houston had surpassed Galveston in population. By 1930, It was clear that Galveston would never lead again. The island today has about 50,000 residents and a seawall that tourists walk along to look at the Gulf. The seawall is marked at intervals with historical plaques. One of them mentions that the land on the city side of the seawall was raised by 17 feet after 1900. If you stand on the beach side and look up at the top of the seawall, you're looking at roughly the height the water reached on the night of September 8, 1900. Most people who read that information look at the top of the wall and then look at the distance to the nearest buildings and try to process what it means. The orphanage was never rebuilt on that site. There is a historical marker where St. Mary's stood. The marker mentions the sisters and the children and the rope. It doesn't say much more than that, because there isn't much more to say. They sang hymns and tied themselves together so none of the children would be alone in the dark. The rope held. Everything else gave.